In this lecture, I want to turn our attention to the area of styling of our React app. And what we really mean by that is the application of CSS to our components. Now, we could write all of our own CSS from the ground up, or we could avail of a third-party library to do some of that for us. And we're going to take the latter approach. There are many libraries out there. The one that I'm going to use is MaterialUI. And so what it is a library of React components. It was written specifically for React and can only be used with React. So it's a library of components that will handle the styling part of our React app. And we can modify the styling or amend it, and we'll see how to do that as well. But the out-of-the-box styling in most cases is sufficient. I want to talk a little bit about where the name comes from, because it's a kind of an unusual name for a library. And it relates to some research that Google did back, I think, around 2010. And what they embarked on was to try and come up with a set of principles or guidelines in the area of digital user interface design. So back then we had native Android and iOS applications, as well as web applications. But really, there were no overarching design principles that people followed when they were designing the UI part of these apps. So what Google did was, rather than looking at what was kind of best practice back then, or what they might consider to have been good designs back then, instead, what they did was to look at the very kind of first principles of design. And by that, I mean how we actually represent the physical or real world on pen and paper. So the real world, we have textures and surfaces, we have lighting and shadows. How are they actually put down on a two-dimensional surface, i.e. using a ink and paper? And what are the principles and best practices in that kind of sphere? And taking that knowledge, then how can that be enhanced when we are using digital user interfaces, enhanced through technology and enhanced by science? So that was the objective of their research, to come up with the kind of overarching principles or guidelines. And they called the design system, as it's termed, that they came up with, they called it material design. Now, this material design system is not a completely kind of wordy document or set of principles. They took it further, and they then said, let's try and identify a set of core building blocks that should be used or can be used in any digital user interface. And these building blocks are broken up into categories, and I'm just listing the categories here. And these are kind of some of these, many of these are familiar categories to us now. If you have done any, be it web app implementation or native app implementation. They call these things, or they label them material components, but it's not component in the kind of React sense. It's the use of the word component from a generic point of view. I think building blocks might be a better term for us to use, because we don't want to confuse component in the material sense with component in the React sense, although there are similarities. And so the categories of building blocks are, number one, what they called display building blocks. And these building blocks are linked to how we kind of structure content on a web page. or any digital user interface. And so there are things like tabs and grids and lists and cards. These are the core building blocks that they identified or defined for the developer community. There are navigation building blocks. So things like, well, some of them we may not have heard of. So there's things like a navigation drawer, which we'll see in our implementation later on. Sorry, tabs. Tabs is more linked to navigation. I said tabs was part of display, but tabs is actually part of what they consider a core navigation building block. There are then these action building blocks. So what are we saying there? There are things like floating action buttons. We'll see what they are later on. Clearly, there are input building blocks, drop-down menus, checkboxes, text boxes, all of that. And finally, they defined a set of communication building blocks or communication components. So things like messaging and dialogues and things called snack bars. So as I said, some of these terms are familiar to you already, some may not be, but we will see a lot of these core material components in our implementations later on. Now, what Google were not trying to achieve from all of this work was to essentially get the developer community to copy them. And so part of this material design system also talks about theming. And by theming, we're talking about the use of color and the use of typography. And really, it's a matter of personal preferences as to the color scheme that you might want to use in your app, or the type of typography that you might want to use. It's kind of would reflect a certain branding that you might want to associate with your app. And that's completely a personal choice. But what the material design system does advise us on is perhaps in the area of coloring, you should declare a primary and a secondary color scheme, and then consistently use that throughout the various pages of the various views that make up your app. In the area of typography, what they did recommend is, I think they came up with 13 different typography styles. And really then it's a question of you picking the styles that you think were appropriate, pick a subset of them and use them consistently throughout your various views. So it is a matter of choice, but they do give some guidelines in terms of how you should approach theming, but it's completely configurable. Now we'll see when we start using the material design, the MaterialUI library, that in the area of typography, there are predefined typing systems or typing styles that come out of the box from the library, and we will just leverage those. But we can actually tweak them if we wish via CSS. So that brings us back to MaterialUI, which is this third-party React library of components, and it's based on this material design system. And so what we will see when we start looking or start using the library is there are components in the library, and I'm listing some of them here, which reflect the material design system itself. So there'll be components called cards and boxes, grids, menus, snack bars, which is a communications building block, typography, etc., etc. Now, at some stage, we may need to tweak the default styling that comes with all of these third-party components that I'm mentioning here. And so how do we actually approach that, or how does the library require us to approach that custom styling? And it decided to take what's referred to as the CSS in JS approach towards applying your own styling to components defined by the library. And I just want to briefly explain this CSS in JS approach. So what it is a way of essentially including CSS within your JavaScript code base. CSS and JS is a kind of a generic approach. It's not unique to the MaterialUI library. It's just the approach that they adopted. So just to explain the CSS and JS approach. So what we have on the left is just some standard, let's suppose we've got some standard CSS, which we've stored in a CSS file. If we want to use that CSS within our JavaScript code, then the way you would go about it is you'd import the CSS file, and then you'd apply it to whatever elements using this approach here, which we've seen already, and we've done that already. So that's the standard way of applying CSS to a particular component. Let's call this a component, a React component. Now, the CSS and JS approach is different, and it essentially kind of allows us to include the CSS as part of our JavaScript code base, but you do have to make slight changes. So on the right, what you're seeing is, well, I'm showing you how we can use CSS and JS specifically with the MaterialUI library, and that will suffice to understand roughly how this approach works. So there's kind of three parts to it. Apart from the imports, we've got to import certain functions, I guess, from the MaterialUI library. But the first thing we've got to do is essentially write our CSS, but write it as a JavaScript object using JavaScript object syntax. So if you kind of compare the CSS that I have on the left here, it's very similar to this object that I am declaring here. And the only difference is there are two differences, I think, really. Number one, you've got to use camel case for your CSS class name. So it's my header here with a capital H, as opposed to the hyphenated approach that you take in standard CSS. And that's mandatory. You cannot use the hyphenated naming convention over here. It has to be camel case. This follows the kind of JavaScript object notation, you know, so you've got your kind of key value pairs, but other than that, it's almost literally taking the CSS that you see on the left and copying and pasting it and making slight syntactic changes to it. And so we construct an object, JavaScript object, and we pass it to this special function that's provided by the MaterialUI library, the make styles function. And what it returns is a function. This is an actual function. And then you've got to invoke that function in the body of your React component. And it returns an object called the classes object. Now, you could regard this classes object as a kind of an object representation of my CSS on the left. And then we can apply this object to any component that we want to using this kind of syntax here. Classes dot my header is clearly referring to this piece of CSS styling that I want to have applied to my header. So it's a little bit clumsy, I think, but we have to go with it because it's what's required by the library. So there are the 3 steps. Write your CSS in JavaScript object notation, pass it to this special function provided by the MaterialUI library. And then it returns a function as well, invoke that function. And then what it returns is an object, and use that object within your styling attributes of your components. So that's CSS and JS, and that's what we need to do if we do want to customize the CSS of any MaterialUI components that we use, and we will be using a lot of them, although we won't be writing a lot of custom CSS. Now, I could have used a number of other libraries as an alternative to MaterialUI, and I'm not suggesting that MaterialUI is the best, although it is highly regarded in the community. So there are other libraries. Tailwind, for example, has become a very popular library in kind of recent years. Chakra was popular for a while, but I think it's slightly less so now. React Bootstrap was the original third-party React library, styling library that mostly everybody used, but it's kind of fallen off in popularity. So there are all these alternative libraries. Now, they don't necessarily all adhere to the material design system. In fact, I don't think maybe React Bootstrap does, but the other ones don't necessarily comply with that. And also, they don't necessarily use the CSS and JS approach either. So, those 2 aspects of MaterialUI were just decisions made by the MaterialUI design team themselves. There are alternatives to material design. There is an approach called the Ant design system, which is also extremely popular. And as I've already said, there are alternatives to using CSS and JS. So there's something called CSS modules, and there's the BEM approach. So there's lots of choice out there, but we are just going down the MaterialUI approach in this module. And you will use MaterialUI in the second of this week's labs, and we will be using it throughout the remaining labs as well. So you will have built up quite a lot of knowledge and use of the library by the end of this section of the module. Okay, that's it. Talk to you later.